Good morning. It is good to be with you this morning. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad to be back. I was at camp last week, and so I am tired, but glad to be here. It was actually really, really cool in Oklahoma this year. It rained every day a little bit. Now, I don't think it rained for us like it rained for you. But it was enough to keep camp cool. It was enough that on Tuesday night I had to cover my head from the fan because it was cold sleeping. But that was all right. We had a great time. Took a group out there. This is the group that we took. There were 10 kids, and there were 3 adults. And so we had a good group. It's one of those things. We took 3 the first year, and 6 the next year, and 10 this year. Always understand that we take those that God desires to go, and it was a great group. We had a lot of fun. Of course, the big news from camp this year is Chance Braswell was baptized this year. You'll notice that's our own Jonathan Martin who's doing the baptizing, and so it was a neat time. We're proud of Chance. He's not here right now. I don't know where he's at, but we will circle up with him as soon as he is here and back with us. So a couple things I want to talk about just sort of before we get started is there's a list of school supplies on the round table in the foyer, and there's a basket sitting off over to the side of the foyer where you can put those school supplies. The school supplies are going to go down into inner city Houston as part of the Campaign for Christ this year in August. The congregations in town are sort of getting together and doing some things together, and so I would encourage you to pick up a school supply list. I look at that and went, that's one of the things we can do, and so I would encourage you to do that. The cost for a bag is about $6, and then I was at Walmart the other day, and everything is on sale for much less than it usually is, and so you can probably get that even cheaper right now. But if you'd like to do that, just please participate by picking up a list and doing that. Jam Camp is next Tuesday for campers. There is still lots of room for your campers who were 2nd grade to 5th grade last school year. And so if you'd like to register, please register. You can do that online at the website, or you can do that in paper format in the foyer. But please go ahead and register. Like I said, there's plenty of room for campers at Jam Camp this year. Landon Ferris is 5, and we all know Landon. Landon had a really hard day yesterday. Landon got up, and by about 11 o'clock in the morning, he had 3 seizures. And then by 2 o'clock, he had a total of 5, maybe 6. And so he's down at Texas Children's Hospital. You know that Landon has a brain tumor, and that presses on his brain and messes some things up. And so we want to be praying for Landon this morning. There's a card on the round table in the foyer and some markers. It's a big card. Going to ask you to go ahead and sign that. We'll carry it down to Landon and to Jacoby just to let them know we're thinking about them and we're praying for them. Landon's grandmother called me yesterday, and it's important for Jacoby to remain connected, and we can understand that. And so we'd be asking that you be praying for Landon. Would ask that you go ahead and sign the card so we can take it down to him. There are some folks here this morning that I want to sort of recognize really quickly. You're always in trouble when you do this. I'd like to call everybody's name who is a special guest this morning, but I can't. But I do want to point out that Troy and Annette Buck are here. And I get to do that again because Annette's last name was not Buck yesterday. It was Willis. But they were married last night here in the church building, and we had a great time. But Troy and Annette, just stand up, pop up real quick. They're in the back there. Just pop up real quick. Whoop, there they are. Make sure you meet them, congratulate them. Jim Rice is here this morning, but he was probably here last week, wasn't he? So that's no news anymore. He left already too, see? Did he stay to hear George preach? Yeah, I'm just curious. Because he doesn't stay to hear me. Already left. I appreciate George for filling in last week. I was at camp. George did a great job. I watched it online. You can watch it online at the website. George is right in the middle of this whole group of good-looking Bill Rasco pictures. And so you can do that. But go see the website, check that out. But shake George's hand because I do appreciate what George did and his willingness to fit in. And then Yvonne Talbert is here. Yvonne, where are you at? Right here. Just pop up real quick. Yvonne, okay, you have a seat. Yvonne went with us. Yvonne is a member over at Huffsmith. She went with us to Medina, to the Arms of Hope Vacation Bible School, Medina campus, and really connected with the kids, appreciate her. She showed up this morning, and her first question to me was, where's the kids? And so I just appreciate the fact that she's here and the fact that she's with us this morning. We have been talking before I left about being rooted and what it means to be rooted. And this morning we pick back up after last week. Last week you talked about how beautiful heaven must be. But this morning we pick it back up in terms of what it is to talk about being rooted. And just want to sort of recap this morning. We've been talking about rooted in terms of Jesus invites us to be anchored in Him and to absorb what it is that He is willing or is allowing us to take on. We start out saying we're rooted in the great I Am, that we are rooted in the character and the presence of God and the character and the presence of Jesus. And so each week we look at how Jesus gives us a picture and then provides us an anchor point for faith and then how we absorb that. Now we always start out with I Am. We always start out with the character of God, with the person of God. What God is working in our life is transformation. God is working in our life to make us more and more Christ-like, to make us like Jesus. We are called to look like Jesus. Jesus uses 7 I Am statements in the book of John to describe His nature and character and also to describe the transformation that takes place as we absorb His character. We started out in John chapter 6 where Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And we looked at Jesus feeding the 5,000 and Jesus talking about the fact that He was willing to provide and that He was calling us to live in His provision. And we really talked about the desires of Jesus and how we take on the desires that Jesus has and what Jesus desires for us. We moved then to John chapter 9 and the healing of a blind man where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And we talked about what it meant to be light and how Jesus, being the light, exposes the darkness in our lives and exposes the darkness in our world. But we talked about absorbing the vision of Jesus and becoming people who see in the way that Jesus sees in the world around us. This morning, we move to John chapter 10, and we talk about the fact that Jesus says, I am the door of the sheep. The NIV says, I am the gate of the sheep. And that door-gate picture is one of those really neat pictures for us from Scripture, one of those neat pictures for Jesus. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the fact that Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, okay? And so we're going to spend 2 weeks really sort of talking about shepherding and talking about what it is that Jesus does in that place. And so I thought just to get started, we ought to have a good idea of what sheep are like, okay? Because when Jesus talks about sheep in this passage, and Jesus is talking about flocks and he's talking about herds, He's talking about us, okay? He's looking and saying, I want you to identify with the sheep, and I want you to identify with the shepherd. So I always get curious. I wasn't raised around sheep. And so what are sheep like? What do sheep do? And so when looking for a resource, I found the official Australian guide to sheep rearing. And it's written in English, just in case you didn't know. And that was a joke. You can laugh. Okay. Yes, they speak English over there. It's a different kind of it. No. So anyway, it lists the advantages of sheep rearing, and it lists 3 advantages. The first advantage to sheep rearing is this herding instinct. Sheep tend to stay together. If you get them all in a group and you get them all in a bunch, chances are most of them will still be in the bunch after you get them all together, okay? Now, we're going to talk about the fact that some wander off and some do some silly things, but for the most part, once you get them together, they stay together. The second is their ability to reproduce. They multiply quickly. They grow quickly, multiply easily. But if you get a small herd to begin with, there's a chance that herd will grow through reproduction, through the fact that they mate and do that. Number 3 is that sheep are obedient, or that obedience is a positive, is an advantage. Sheep can be taught to obey, okay? And so 3 great things about sheep, 3 advantages to rearing sheep, 3 things that stand out in terms of sheep rearing. But the official Australian Guide to Sheep Herding goes on to talk about the disadvantages. Number 1, the disadvantage is that sheep are not adapted to heat nor dryness. And so they're not used to conditions that are sort of outside their norm. They're not used to conditions that don't quite fit with some of the surroundings that they're in, and so they need something because they don't adapt to that. Number two, sheep can't survive without adequate food. Now, I read that one and went, well, no duh, because I don't thrive without adequate food. Somebody looked at me today and said, did you lose weight? I said, I went to camp. They don't feed us enough to counteract the calories you burn. So I probably should spend more time at camp. But this one is one of those things that was interesting. Sheep don't store as much. They do some storing, but they don't store as much fat and they don't store as much reserve as other animals like cows or like horses or like. And so sheep really have to be washed and a little bit babied. They have to have adequate food every day. They have to be fed a certain amount every day or else they really begin to suffer. Number three, sheep are fragile. Despite their appearance, and a sheep appears rough and a sheep appears hardy, sheep are actually pretty fragile, prone to breaking legs, prone to cuts and scrapes and that kind of thing. And so it's hard to keep up with the injuries on a sheep sometime. So there's a warning there. Sheep, number four, are naturally defenseless. They don't have they don't have big fangs, they don't have big claws. They're not real fast runners, you know. So basically, they're pretty helpless, pretty defenseless, need something, someone to watch over them. I thought, well, 3 advantages, 4 disadvantages, not too bad, except for then you turn the page and there's more disadvantages to owning sheep. Number 5, they're susceptible to parasites. Anything that can live on them will live on them. Number 6, sheep must be watched continually, cannot leave them alone, especially at night is when they need protection from things like predators and things like wolves and stuff like that. And then number 8, sheep are short-sighted. The Australian Guide to Sheep Herding says sheep only see 6 feet. And I don't know if that's with their heads down. I don't know if that's, but that's the rule is that if you're gonna raise sheep, you got to understand that 6 feet is about the limit for them. I look at the advantages and disadvantages, and there's part of me that goes, I'm a little bit offended. If I was to look at myself as a sheep, is it true that I am defenseless? Yeah, it is. Among things that matter, right? Now, I can stand up for myself in an argument. I can stand up for myself and fight for myself. We go do, but when it comes to things that Jesus is going to talk about, things like sin and things like brokenness and things like separation from God, I am fairly defenseless, right? I do not know what to do about some of those things on my own. I have to have somebody in my life who helps me to see those things, don't I? When it comes to being short-sighted, I would not call myself short-sighted normally. But when it comes to spiritual matters, there are things that I am short-sighted about. I need somebody to clear my vision. So it fits right in with what Jesus has been talking about. When he calls himself the bread of life, when he calls himself the light of the world, Jesus goes on to talk about being the door of the sheep because we have a need. We have this longing. We have this just inherent need for who Jesus is and what it is that Jesus offers. And so I'd invite you to open up your Bibles to John chapter 10. We're going to read the first 10 verses. I appreciate Mike reading this morning. Gave us a feel for what it is that Jesus is doing, what it is that Jesus is saying in this place. And I always appreciate that. Jesus in this passage is going to draw a picture. Now, a couple things I think I need you to understand before we get there is because sheep are the way that they are, because sheep need protection, because sheep need somebody at night, because sheep are prone to parasites, because they're fragile, because sheep are generally kept in sheepfolds or sheep pens. Now, in ancient Israel, sheep pens came in 2 varieties. One was the public in-town variety. And in-town, you could go in to a sheepfold, and it was kind of a stone wall built up against generally a house, sort of a covered barn area, and you could lead the sheep in, and there was a gate there and a gatekeeper. Then you would go in and say, hey, I'm going to put my sheep in for the night, and the gatekeeper would open the gate, and the shepherd would count his sheep as they went in, and he'd check them and do his thing, and they would all go into sort of this communal pen. Now, the next shepherd that came in and brought his sheep in would put his sheep in the same pen as yours. And then the third shepherd that came in would come in and put his sheep in the same pen as yours. And so the sheep would get mixed up at night, and they would be all in there and sort of all doing their sheepy kind of a thing at night, and the shepherd would get a chance to go and to rest and to go home. and do that and come back in the morning in order to care for sheep. The other kind of sheep pen is sort of this kind of a sheep pen. Now this is a drawing, and it's a little more fancy than I think what we would realize, but this would be in the countryside. And in the countryside, the shepherd would basically take the stones that were laying around and stack them in a circle, and stack them high enough to provide a little bit of a barrier for the sheep, and he'd leave a space in there. And the space is where the sheep would go in and out. And so the shepherd would lead his sheep to that opening, that space, and he'd allow the sheep to go in. The sheep would go in, and they would sleep in this interior space behind this sort of sort of very basic, crude stone wall. And then the shepherd would lay inside the door. He didn't carry a gate around with him. He didn't carry around, a sliding door to stick in those walls. He would get in there, and he'd get all the sheep in, and he'd lay in the doorway. That way, if a sheep tried to get out or somebody tried to get in, the shepherd would feel that, okay? Now, it's possible to go over the walls. It's possible to climb in through another area, but the shepherd would become the gate that would protect the sheep. As Jesus talks in John chapter 10 about being the gate, it's that picture, I think, that we need to have in our minds, okay? I think he uses both pictures, both sheep pens in the passage, but I want us to understand why he's headed to. Did I just run out of battery? Did I? No? Okay. Wow, I just went sort of silent in my own ears. But I want us to understand why Jesus talks about being the gate or being the door. This is the picture of the shepherd laying down in front of the door. And so here we go. He says, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. I'm in John chapter 10, starting in verse 2 here. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Now, the picture here is that very public picture, right? That in the morning the shepherd gets up and he goes to the sheep pen in the city, and he gets to the watchman, right? And the watchman says, oh, you're here to get your sheep. And the shepherd says, yes, I am. And the watchman opens the gate and does what? He says, here, sheepy, 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 or whatever it is, the shade of sheep, right? And his sheep begin to come out from that mixed herd. And his sheep begin to separate themselves from the rest of the sheep in the pen. And they begin to walk out of the doorway where the shepherd stands. Why? Because they know his voice. They know that this is the guy that they're supposed to be following. Verse 4, when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. One of those things about shepherding in Israel, which you may have heard before, is that shepherding in Israel very different than the kind of herding we do here, or the kind of herding they do in Australia. If we herd, what do? We stand behind a group of animals and we push them forward, don't we? Now you've seen the pictures, you've seen the westerns. It is time to get all the cattle moving, towards the OK Corral or wherever it is. They're going to Kansas. Seems like they're always going to Kansas for something. But anyway, so what do? They get on the horse, and they get behind the cattle, and they start behind the cattle, and they start to move, and they get in the cattle all get in the same direction, to push the cattle along, whatever it is. That's herding. That's how we move them. Sheep don't do that real well. You get behind the sheep and start to push forward, and sheep tend to go over here, and they get over there, and they tend to try to come back because they want to get around behind. Sheep like to be led. In Israel, when you're walking along and you see a herd of sheep, what you generally see is someone walking in front or among the first of the sheep. And they walk, and the sheep follow. And so the picture here is that the shepherd stands in the gate, and he calls to his sheep, and because they know his voice, they begin to follow him. And as he walks out, they continue to follow him because they know his voice. And that's always a neat picture to me, because that means that the shepherd is talking to the sheep. And that means the shepherd is singing. And that means the shepherd is vocal about what it is that he's doing. Robin laughs at me because I talk to the dogs all the time. But that's the picture I have of the shepherd, is talking to the sheep. He's talking to the sheep, and the sheep go out, and they follow where he goes because he's engaged in that place, and they know his voice, and they're listening to what it is he has to say. Verse 5, they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. And so Jesus is very clear about that. Verse 6, Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them because nobody wants to consider themselves a sheep, do they? We don't want to consider our need for being led, our need for following Jesus. Therefore, in verse 7, Jesus said, again, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. And so he comes back to that place and says, I am the gate for the sheep. And I want you to understand something, that when Jesus places himself in that role of the gate, he would place himself in the role of the door. When he places himself there in the role of that shepherd, in that very specific instance, what Jesus is doing is Jesus is saying, I want you to understand my nature, I want you to understand my character, I want you to understand what I have to offer you in order for you to have an anchor in life, in order for you to have a place where you can settle and grow as Christians, so that you can invest in me, so that you can come to this place. What is it that Jesus wants to do? What is it that Jesus wants to work in the lives of people? First thing that Jesus wants to do, or the first thing that Jesus does, is Jesus calls us out of the world and into himself. Now that's what Jesus does, isn't it? We talk about Jesus coming to earth. What does he come for? He comes to call us out of the world. Come away from those people. Come away from what the world offers. Come away from those things that can harm you. Come away from those things that can destroy you. It is like the shepherd who stands at the door and says, I am here for my sheep. Come to me. And those that will hear the voice of God, those that will hear the voice of Jesus, begin to move to a voice of love, and to a voice of care, and to a voice of concern, to the shepherd who wants to lead them, who wants to guide them, who wants to give them direction. Because when Jesus calls his people out of the world, he says, come and do what? Follow me. Let me show you where to go. Let me show you where to eat. Let me show you where there is quiet water. Psalm 24, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie in green pastures. He leads me beside the quiet waters. There's that picture of nourishment. There's that picture of feeding. There's a picture of direction that Jesus is showing us where to go. Jesus is showing us how to live. Jesus invites us to follow him, not as just, come on, we're going to go this, but it's a call to intimacy. It's a call to be his. Because Jesus wants to speak, and Jesus wants to sing, and Jesus wants to be close to who we are. See, when Jesus takes on the role of the gate or the role of the door, he says, I'm taking on all of those things that means. If I am the protector, if I am this doorway, if I am this gate, then that means there are some things that I want to do for you that are pretty cool, because you are my sheep. And so he calls us to intimacy with him. Jesus protects us. Jesus looks at us and says, I know that you are prone to things that you shouldn't have to deal with, that you are prone to sin, and that you're prone to falling, and that you're prone to being hurt. But Jesus protects us. He wants to step in, and he wants to fix our woundedness, our brokenness. He wants to step in and make a transformation in our lives, to make a healing in our lives. And so he takes on that role, that shepherding role of protection. Jesus leads us. Well, he provides direction, I know, but he goes back to this place and says he leads us. Not only does he provide us protection, not only take us to where it is we need to go, but in this leading place, Jesus is very clear that we walk where he walks. That the transformation that occurs in this place is that we take the same steps that Jesus takes, that we walk in his footsteps. You and I know that spiritual growth is about what? It's about God transforming our lives to look like, I think you forgot, I've only been gone a week. That God is transforming our lives in order to help us look like, that's right. And so we take the footsteps that Jesus takes. Jesus offers us a path, a very clear path to walk with him. Jesus calls us and says, I want to lead you in this place. And so as we walk with him and we are transformed to look like him, there are some things we have to absorb. There are some things that we have to take on. There are some things that when we follow Jesus that we are supposed to soak up. What are those things? If you go back over to John chapter 10 and start at verse 8, he says this, all whoever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. The first thing that Jesus promises that we can absorb when we walk with him is salvation. Okay? Now, salvation a lot of times gets sort of a limited reputation, because salvation is something that comes at the end of life when we're all dead and we go to heaven, right? Salvation is a lifestyle. And the Bible talks about that salvation is a lifestyle. That salvation enters our lives today and at every moment that we walk with Jesus and transforms who we are, changes who we are, that salvation brings with it this understanding that we belong to God, that we are directed by God, that we are led by Jesus, that we share a certain amount of protection, that we have direction. All those things that Jesus promises are found in salvation, and they are found today. They are found in this life. I stand in the presence of God today and live my life in the power of God today because I walk with Jesus today. Amen? That's the way that it's supposed to be. See, when Jesus says, what is it that I want you to get when you come and you anchor yourself into me, he says, I want you to absorb salvation. And every day I want you to understand that you live in that relationship, that you live in a secure place, that you live in a place where I love and I comfort and I protect you, right? Now, sheep have a tendency to wander away, and Jesus has a plan for that, a plan to chase us down, a plan to call to us, but he says, I want you to live in this assurance because I want you to have life, and I want you to have an abundant life, right? Verse 9, I am the gate. Whoever enters to me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I think I like the King James there where it says, I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. That's what Jesus wants us to soak up. He wants us to soak up a life that is rich in His presence, that is full of His grace, that is full of His love and His care, that is full of His leadership and protection. Jesus says, I want you to experience salvation in every moment and to live a life that's so full that it overflows. How? How can I live that kind of life? It's not a secret. See, Jesus says in the text, when I call them, they will do what? They will listen to His voice. And so what do we need to do to absorb who it is that Jesus is? We need to listen to His voice. I'm always amazed at what happens in this place. We come here today and we gather here today to worship, to give back, to pour out ourselves to God, and yet in everything we do, God is pouring Himself into us. We hear what He has to say through the words of the Bible. We hear what He has to say through the words of those who read and through those who speak. We're very concerned about being Christ-centered and talking about Jesus in this place. We hear the voice of God in communion as He says, this is what I did for you. This is how much I love you. We hear it in the singing and in the words that we sing to each other. Don't we? We come to this place and God speaks to us over and over and over again in this time and calls us to be His, to soak up what it is that He wants. And so how do I absorb that? One is I come and I get here and I worship, Bible class, spiritual friendship, sharing life, right? There are all kinds of things that God says, I want you to do, but God speaks to us all the time. But God doesn't speak just to hear Himself talk, does He? He calls us. How do we do that? We listen to His voice and we follow Him. We make a decision to walk where it is that Jesus walks. We make a decision to go where it is that Jesus goes because Jesus wants to transform us. Jesus wants to change us. Jesus wants to make us different. One of the cool things about the passage, and one of the things we don't always see, is that Jesus looks at us and says, you're sheep now, but I'm changing you into shepherds. I'm changing you into people who can live out the life that the shepherd lives. I'm changing you to transform you to live like Jesus lives. And so I want you to become what I am. We understand that's the process of transformation, to become like Jesus, right? We've already said that. So the challenge this week has to do with Psalm 84:10. If you want to turn over there, you can. Psalm 84:10 is a great passage. The psalmist writes these words. He says, better is one day in your courts, and he's talking to God, and he's pouring himself out before God. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I'd rather spend one day with Jesus than to spend 1,000 days anywhere else, right? Now, do we look at that and go, well, I'd rather spend 1,000 days with one day with Jesus than 1,000 days in jail? That's not what the psalmist says. The psalmist says, I'd rather spend one day with Jesus because it's better than 1,000 days at Disneyland. Disneyland's the happiest place on earth, Bill. You can't mean, that's exactly what I mean. That's what Jesus calls. One day in your courts is better than 1,000 days anywhere else. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of the wicked. And what the psalmist says there is, I would rather be a doorkeeper. What has Jesus called himself in John chapter 10? I am the door, right? I am the door of the sheep. You and I are called to be doorkeepers, to be people who stand at the door and say, here's the way. Here's where Jesus is at. Here's what Jesus is doing. And so, this week, I'd like you to let Psalm 84:10 shape your heart. Open a door into God's presence for someone this week. I'm going to ask for an action this week, okay? I'm going to ask you to be deliberate about opening that door and showing somebody else Jesus this week. I want you to make a special effort to make someone feel welcome, to make someone feel encouraged, to make someone feel blessed, okay? When they come in to work in the morning, you be there at the door with a cup of coffee and you say, I am so glad you're here. And they're going to look at you and say, you had a good weekend? And here's what you get to say. Yes, because I spent some time with Jesus this weekend. I just want to pass on the blessing. Oh, Bill, that sounds a little bit out. I know. But you and I are not called to be the same. You and I are called to be different. You and I are called to be doorkeepers. Can you make someone feel welcome this week? Can you encourage somebody this week? Can you make somebody feel blessed? Can you make sure they understand that they feel that way because of Jesus? There's the challenge, isn't it? There's the challenge. Hebrews chapter 10. One more passage and we're going to be done. Hebrews chapter 10. Starting in verse 19, the Hebrew writer writes this. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body. The Hebrew writer looks at his audience and says, do you want to be close to God? Do you want to enter the most holy place? Do you want to live where God lives? Then come in through Jesus. Come in through the way that Jesus has opened. Come in through the doorway that Jesus offers. It's an invitation to live in the presence of God. This morning, we want to offer the same invitation. We want to offer a chance for you to live every day in the presence of God. What needs to change in your life? Do you need to die to self and be baptized? Do you need to repent? What is it that it's going to take? Jesus is the door of the sheep. Jesus makes a way. There is nothing in your life that Jesus cannot change, that Jesus cannot transform, that Jesus cannot make new, if only you'll answer the invitation by coming forward right now as we stand and as we